Great. Sorry, I was just setting up the webinar there to record. Good afternoon. You're very welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sandra Galvin. I'm the coordinator for the HRB-TMRN. And today I'm joined behind the scenes with Rachel Lee, who is another PhD student of the HRB-TMRN. So Marina, you're very welcome. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me okay, Rachel and Sandra?
Great. Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. So I'll just give it a little bit of an introduction, Marina, if that's okay, and then I'll hand it over the controls to you.
Perfect. Go for it. Thanks, Sandra.
Great. Thanks. So everyone, you're very welcome. We are joined today by two groups. One group, which is the online group. You're very welcome via the webinar. And also, I believe we have the health systems team there in UCD who are joining via their weekly seminar in the room there with Marina, and you're all very welcome. So Marina is a PhD student in the School of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Systems in UCD and also with the HRB-TMRN. Marina has an MSc in Translational Medicine and a BSc in Pharmacology. The focus of her PhD research is in understanding the roles and responsibilities of statisticians and their involvement in academic and industry-led clinical trials and their collaborations with clinicians, scientists and other key clinical research members. So certainly a very topical research study, Marina. One question that I have to ask you, what was it that Ian Chalmers said your surname meant again? I had a quick look there and it came up as intelligent.
Oh yeah, exactly, that's right.
Is that it?
That's right, he spent a bit of time in Palestine and I'm from Egypt, so he recognised the Arabic and
brilliant.
Yeah, so yeah, smart. We'll see how this webinar leads into my surname and actually makes sense, the smartness of it, but sure.
Great. So for those of you that were there with us on our 2015 symposium, Sir Ian Chalmers was giving his keynote speech, and the first thing he mentioned was to comment on Marina's surname. So there was a nice little shout out from Sir Chalmers. So Marina is studying under the supervision of Professor Eilish McAuliffe, who is the Professor of Health Systems in UCD and is an executive member of the HRB-TMRN, and her co-supervisors include Dr. Marie Galligan, who's a biostatistician and clinical research tutor in the School of Medicine in UCD, and also our very own Professor Declan Devan, who is Director of the HRB-TMRN and the Professor of Midwifery here in NUI Galway. I am recording the webinar, and the recording will be available soon this afternoon for anyone to have a look back and look at the slides. So I'm going to hand over the controls to you, Marina, so whenever you're ready there, you can start off.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sandra, and thanks for the opportunity to do this webinar, and thank you to my lovely health systems team for joining me here today. So as Sandra mentioned, my background is pharmacology and translational medicine, which basically is translating science into medicine, so from preclinical bench to bedside research. And I kind of stemmed on from that then to look at trials and trial methodology and enter the HRB-TMRN. So my PhD is factors affecting statistical rigour in trials, and today I'm just going to present findings from my literature. Great. So just a little kind of table of contents, really just topics I plan on covering. Brief history and the importance of statistics in research and clinical trials. And then I'll kind of talk about the integration of statistics and clinical data management in trials. I'll be talking about evolution of key guidelines, legislations and regulations, and I kind of realize that I'm preaching to the choir here, but just, I suppose the point of that is just to see where all these aspects integrate together. I'll be talking about interdisciplinary approaches in trials. You probably hear me say that quite a lot. Roles and responsibilities and rights of key team members. Common themes coming from the literature, and I'll put all this in context with my PhD project. So to start off, don't worry, this won't be a full history lesson or anything, but just to start off, aside from the first trial in the book of Daniel in the Bible, the 1753 documented trial was the 1747 trial by James Lind, a Scottish physician on board the Salisbury. So what James Lind did was he noticed scurvy essentially could be treated by citrus fruits, and he wanted to introduce vitamin C as a treatment for sailors that had scurvy. So he had a rationale, he had a study design, he had an inclusion criteria, which were sailors on board with scurvy, and he had a treatment, which was the vitamin C, and he had a clinical assessment. So without knowing it, Lind had actually followed the clinical trial protocol. So this was kind of the beginning stages of introducing what we now know to be the modern concept of trials. So stemming on from that then, Ronald Fisher, a statistician in 1926, introduced the concept of randomization. I'll just give this quote cited in one of Sir Ian Chalmers' papers by Marx. The RCT is an extension of Fisher's ideas about an experimental design. The statistician's randomized controlled trial came to represent the symbol and substance of statistical method in medicine. So what that kind of means is kind of put quite nicely by Sir Ian Chalmers, one of the founders of the Cochrane collaboration, is that a lot of us believe trials originated from statistical thinking. So there is a certain truth to that. When we hear of trials, we think randomized controlled trials. But it was a lot more than that. It was the technicalities around that, the clinical aspects that merged forces. And I'll talk about that in this slide. So stemming on then from 1926, the 1948 Medical Research Council trial to evaluate streptomycin in pulmonary tuberculosis was actually the first trial to use random numbers when allocating treatment and control cohorts. So we now know this to be the first actual trial to conform to modern day principles of clinical practice. So it's kind of stemming on from 1926 up to 1948 when randomization was actually used. So it's a bit of a gap. Good scientific practice then, according to Pocock, was not actually common until several years later. And it wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century, and even coming into this day and age, that both clinical and statistical reasoning, I suppose, joined forces or kind of merged together to form the trials that we know today. So in kind of with that brief history, just showing the importance of the clinical aspect of the protocol with Lind and the randomization and the statistics, the RCT then became described as an application of statistical methods. This is a paper from 1979, and you'll hear me say this a lot in this presentation, but the point I'm trying to get at today is that statistics is not just, you know, your SPSS database and clicking a couple of buttons. It's not just the analysis. It's the pre-planning and understanding the importance of statistical expertise in the decision-making and the trial design. Just a little quote from the ethical guidelines from the American Statistical Association. The use of statistics in medical diagnosis and biomedical research may affect whether individuals live or die, whether their health is protected or jeopardized, and whether medical science gets advanced or sidetracked. And that's very, very important in terms of understanding the clinical significance of a statistically significant result. In terms of inappropriately designed trials and inadequate statistical analysis make for unreliable results with little confidence in clinical interpretation. So you've heard me talk a little bit about this kind of thing, but where do statistics and clinical data management actually come into play in trials? So I do apologize for the busyness of this slide, but this is when you glance at it from afar, the first thing that comes to mind is probably our more statistical aspect in the trial design part than the analysis. And so the point of this slide is just to show the statistical strategy and the statistical thinking that goes into a trial. Things like sample size calculations, refining research questions, forming case report forms. So all of these are kind of joint efforts between statisticians, clinical data management team members, but also principal investigators. Some things that I've kind of highlighted are just forming a clinical data management team, and I'll head into this a little bit in my presentation, where the ideal, I suppose, data management team is not always feasible to have, especially in academic-led trials in terms of funding. Other things I've highlighted, the word adherence there is highlighted about 2 or 3 times. So the importance of adhering to trial documentation indirectly impacts statistics. Communication, data collection, data verification, all these, and the importance of complying with ethical, legal, and regulatory frameworks, all play a role in the rigor of statistics in the trial. So you've heard me say statistical rigor a couple of times without actually me mentioning what it is. Well, statistical rigor, my kind of interpretation of it is statistics that is of a high standard quality, but also thoroughness, to accurately extrapolate results from analysis, with the end product, in our case and in this context, being clinically meaningful findings. So stemming on from that, then you heard me talk about adherence to documentation. So, as I mentioned, statistics is not just the analysis, but statistics should also be talked about and discussed in a research proposal. So things like randomization or how data will be collected. And a lot of the literature talks about, calls for statisticians to be involved early on in a research proposal to allow for a strong application. It also has the added benefit of statistical thinking and protocols to be familiar with research questions and statistical design, variables, instruments, and units to be measured. Heading on from that, then, the protocol. So quite a big statistical section is needed in a clinical trial protocol in terms of understanding not just the analysis, but specifying the hypothesis and the treatment effects, justifying sample size, and of course clinical data management involvement in the protocol, to understand things like database design. So I think statistical analysis plan, and this is probably key, but it's everything that's in the protocol should be stated in the statistical analysis plan in more detail. And one thing that I'll head into in quite a little bit, or later on in the presentation, is that any statistical analysis that is not planned in the protocol or is not stated in the protocol is considered additional or exploratory analysis. And I'll head into that in a little bit in terms of selective reporting. Case report forms, so a joint effort between statisticians, clinical data management members, and PIs. The case report form is the first step of a protocol being translated into data collection. It's how you physically get data from a patient in a clinical trial. You wouldn't think this is statistically based, but in terms of data management and inputting data, it's vital that the CRF is robust. Data management and data validation plans, I won't go too much into this, but it gives detail about data entry, data tracking, quality control measures, and then how data will be recorded. And similarly for data validation plans, they ensure the validity of data compliance. And then finally, so I've talked about from research proposal and protocol all the way to reporting and publication of a trial, and I'll discuss this in a little bit, but I think all of these kind of documents just are quite important in terms of the scientific and statistical rigor of a trial, not just to enable a knowledgeable reader to recalculate study results, but in terms of trial methodology, it's quite important to be able to replicate these, and that's why they need to be accurate. So you heard me mention at the beginning that my background is translational medicine, from bench to bedside research. Well, I'm kind of heading into this concept now of translational statistics, and I'm kind of directly citing now NUI Galway, John Hind and John Ewell. So not too much in the literature about translational statistics aside from NUIG and Purdue University, but what it is that it's the transfer of relevant and accurate statistical knowledge, not just from clinicians, scientists, and statisticians in a trial team, but also to the media, translating statistically significant findings into something that patients can physically understand related to their health condition, but also quite important for the policymakers as well, in terms of people who can change the course of clinical practice. So it bridges the gap between statisticians, epidemiologists, when communicating study results to the public. And I think this is quite key for translational statistics, understanding the difference between a statistically significant finding. You've got a p-value of less than 0.05, but if it doesn't help a patient that's sitting in front of us, it doesn't have much clinical significance. So it's also kind of heading into the difference between descriptive and inferential statistics, in terms of inferential statistics helps us understand the benefit of one treatment or one approach for a patient being generalized to other patients with similar conditions. So again, sorry, quite a busy slide, but there's just so many guidelines out there. I didn't know what's important and what's not. But so I suppose that these guidelines, they're issued by not just regulatory agencies, but health organizations and expert committees. So the reason a lot of these came out, and actually the first one in 1988 from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, all the way until now, until I think most recent there is 2014, but the need for them came from the variation in the technical requirements each country has. And the healthcare interventions and the differences in them depended on the country, and it kind of led to a need for standardization in trial methodology. And while I won't go into too much of these, I'll just highlight some from the Royal Statistical Society in terms of professional conduct for statisticians. Other things like statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry, PSI in 1994, had guidelines for standard operating procedures in GSP, Good Statistical Practice in Clinical Research. So just to kind of head a little bit more then into ICH. So ICH, I realize I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but just a bit of background about it. The International Conference of Harmonization, joint collaboration between people in pharmaceutical industries in the US, the EU, and Japan Ministry for Health and Welfare. So again, ICH kind of came about due to the need for standardization, and all these statistical aspects came from guidelines from Japan, EU, US, and I'll kind of dig a little bit further into the most important ICH guideline when talking about statistics and trials, and that is E9, called Statistical Principles for Clinical Trials. So, as I mentioned, has combined views from different regulatory agencies, but it was an ICH expert working group that put it together, and it stemmed from the Committee of Medicines and Proprietary Healthcare and the Japanese Ministry for Health and Welfare that helped shape the ICH guideline that we know today. I won't head too much into the actual details of the guidelines, but it gives guidance on trial design, specifies content of protocol, and along with trying to, I suppose, contribute to the rigor, it minimizes bias and maximizes precision. And throughout the guideline, it does essentially what I'm trying to do, and I suppose a baby version, I'm trying to emphasize the crucial role of statistical expertise throughout a trial. It does not cover specific statistical methods. So, little disclaimer here, I myself am not a statistician, so it kind of helps me understand statistical principles without the mathematical algorithms kind of thing. Lays down the framework within which statisticians should operate in a trial, and other guidelines refer directly to ICH E9. And the reason I brought this up is that it's quite important for my own PhD in understanding how much do academic-led trials refer to ICH E9. I'm quite interested in understanding the standardization and the variability in conduct and analysis of trials. So you heard me mention at the beginning kind of this interdisciplinary approach that we have in trials. So I'll just start off with quite a nice quote I found from my lit review. Working collaboratively and understanding the opinions and needs of colleagues at the site will promote a culture of clinical research. And I think this whole idea of collaboration and communication is just, it's absolutely vital, especially in terms of understanding the roles and responsibilities of other team members, but also their rights in terms of rights of being a co-author or rights of being a full collaborator. The evolution of new workforce roles is another quote from the literature in terms of regardless of the discipline, regardless of the profession in trials, there is always a need for training, always a need to kind of attend conferences, read publications. Continuous professional development is just as important in trials as in any other important collaboration. So just to talk about the members of the statistical and the clinical data management team, of course we know about the statisticians, and I've put ×3 with a question mark here because we'll head into that in a little bit in my next slide. Clinical research nurses, often the ones that kind of recruit into trials, and sometimes they're data managers and help to collect data. The PIs, monitors, and then like just the last 2 lines of that, I'm quite conscious that these might be team members in a contract research organization or a pharmaceutical company in an industry. But what I plan to investigate is why this kind of ideal team, having database programmers, clinical research associates, quality control associates, monitors, why these team members are not always in an academic-led trial. That could be due to funding, it could be due to the feasibility, and that's something I plan to investigate as well. So heading into kind of zooming in then on the role of statisticians, so I had ×3 question mark in my last slide. So there's some authors that called for 3 statisticians to be involved in a trial. And the reason for that is study statisticians have general oversight of statistical aspects and participating in the study design all the way through to conduct and analysis. But then others call for independent statisticians in terms of producing interim reports and interim analysis as a trial is going on. And what they do is they relay information back to the data monitoring committee. And independent statisticians, the benefit to them, I suppose, is they are the only ones that have a link between a treatment code and a trial database. And then you have a third statistician that physically sits on the data monitoring committee and plays a role in deciding whether a trial is to be stopped, or this kind of heads into the futility aspect of the trial, or whether it's to be altered. So again, kind of something my PhD was investigate is the feasibility of having 1 statistician on a trial, let alone 3, and why this may not always be possible. We may not even need 3 statisticians. Other terms that statisticians are kind of masked at in the literature, they're kind of referred to as statistical consultants, trial methodologists, statistical programmers, data scientists. And you heard me earlier discuss not just roles and responsibilities, but rights of a statistician. And they have a right to be a full collaborator from the decision-making all the way through. Understanding qualifications, training, and experience of statisticians is quite important to statistical rigor as well. Early involvement is key, and I think I've kind of been discussing that all the way through, that statistics is not just the analysis, but the design as well. So decision-making, planning, not just analysis, and meetings with regulatory authorities, which may be an industry thing, and a lot of the CRCs we have in academic-led trials have regulatory and quality affairs managers, so it may not always be the case statisticians meet with the regulator. Zooming in then to their roles and their responsibilities. So teaching and learning, the literature emphasizes statisticians teaching statistics and research design to members of a trial team. And this is a paper from 1979, so it's not quite a new concept. They allow for transparency in trial hypothesis, and the literature says they have a responsibility as well to facilitate communication to address questions raised by the team, which is beneficial not just for the statistician to learn more, but also for other trial members to be in the know. They have a responsibility to know about their own therapeutic field and to be up to date with novel statistical methods, but also to be familiar with trials and trial methodology. Collaboration, I mentioned at the beginning, translational statistics, but the importance of contacting physicians and clinicians and the research nurses to understand treatment effects and what is clinically important for that intervention. And I put in scientists as well. I'm not being too biased because I'm a biomedical scientist myself, but also because a lot of the literature calls for statisticians to engage in the lab work and engage in routine lab tests to understand the units of measurement. And I had into kind of statisticians in preclinical studies in my later slide. I talked about the importance of document writing, analysis and inferences. I think that's quite key as well, and something that may seem quite basic, just choosing the right statistical methods. But again, if you understand the importance it has in a clinical setting, choosing the right statistical methods is key. I put in the quote here, a fair reflection. So statisticians collaborating with clinicians have a responsibility of ensuring the reporting of a trial. Transparency of medical research is quite a big topic these days. And then other responsibilities, myself, I'm talking to statisticians. These are things we all kind of agreed statisticians would love to have the time to conduct meta-analysis and systematic reviews, especially in terms of an equivalency trial. They're trying to establish a standard of care. But this might not always be the case, and I'll head into kind of time and workloads in my later slide. So just to kind of give an example from a systematic review, Dale Dordas in the UK and Sandra Eldridge's team in London, they looked at trials that were included in their systematic review. What they did was they looked at the co-authorship of statisticians to be a direct indication of their active involvement in trials. And while this may seem quite simple, statisticians usually would have an author, or statisticians are usually involved in a trial. Sometimes this is overlooked. And what they did was they measured the methodological quality of a cluster trial and they compared the importance of having statisticians from the beginning of a trial compared to journals endorsing consort guidelines. So basically, what they found was that where statisticians were co-authors, this improved the methodological quality of a trial more so than reading a journal and reading the guidelines that journals say adhere to consort guidelines for reporting. And their conclusion, and it's something that I'm quite interested in and I hope to investigate in the course of my PhD, is funding bodies and journals should be more effective in promoting active statistician involvement and active statistician co-authorship in a trial. But my PhD plans to investigate why this may not always be the case. So kind of merging then the teams, the statisticians and the clinical data managers, my big slide at the beginning, designing and reviewing case report forms, collecting data from patients. Well, you wouldn't think of it as being statistics, but to ensure the data is collected appropriately allows for precise and unbiased measurements of primary and secondary endpoints. Data managers, and they have this responsibility of kind of overarching data collection instruments and ensuring systems and procedures are carried out, not just, you hear me saying it again, adhering to the protocols, but also to standard operating procedures and, of course, good clinical practice. Early involvement of the data management team is quite key in terms of processing, ensuring that data will be processed correctly in accordance with its original intentions. So in terms of qualifications then of statisticians and having statistics or a mathematical degree, clinical data management team members often have a degree in life sciences, but also prefer to have knowledge of data coding, statistics, and computing facilities. So I suppose the next point is kind of statistical ethics, where data confidentiality is quite important, and maybe not directly for statistics, but in terms of ethics and institutional review boards. The literature talks about how the IRBs will want to know the type of data planned to be collected, what purpose, who has access to the data records and procedures, all to ensure the protection of clinical trial participants. And while it might not seem like statistics, it's the statistical thinking around it, making sure you have data managers and data team members from the beginning. So kind of heading into my last couple of slides, but just some major themes that came up from the literature. So you heard me mention the importance of using correct statistical methods, and its inappropriate use may lead to incorrect findings. And I suppose the literature discusses this as being artificial results, in the sense that it doesn't just waste time and effort of statistical and data experts, but waste expensive resources. Not to mention, of course, the misuse of statistics in the medical and clinical field is not only unethical, but has consequences in a clinical setting. So one paper published last year carried out a survey of statisticians and found that a number of them actually weren't aware of novel statistical methods, and they were quite weary to use statistical methods that have just recently been published for fear that journals wouldn't accept them. So this, I suppose, is important in terms of raising awareness and dissemination of novel statistical methods. Are we using the right statistical methods? Is there a better way to do it? I won't head too much into that because I myself am not a statistician, so just raising that point. The importance of clinicians in trials as well, to be knowledgeable and understand statistics to maintain the integrity of a trial. And I suppose this is where kind of industry and academia also comes into play, where the benefit of having a trial in academia is attending biostatistics courses. And this is one thing that's mentioned in the literature about no matter how many experts you have in industry, sometimes the option to attend courses isn't always there. So reporting, I mentioned at the beginning, but I will come back to this. So plays a role in statistical rigor. Quite recently, well, this paper published in 1992, but we're hearing a lot about it these days. Editors of journals mandating the use of statistical guidelines when publishing. But not only that, but also strengthening statistical peer review. So there's now a call for papers to be reviewed by qualified and experienced statisticians, and I think this can kind of be seen as a facilitator as well for statistical rigor, in that the literature talks about the system relying too heavily on statistical expertise of subject reviewers that may miss subtle statistical methodology mistakes or statistical methodology best practice for a specific trial. So there's a call for industry to disclose if they've had an independent statistical review in a clinical trial report, and this kind of heads into the conflict of interest, and I'll be discussing that in, I think it's my last slide. So you heard me mention at the beginning that any analysis that is not planned in the protocol or is not planned in the statistical analysis plan in the beginning of the trial and is still conducted at the end is considered a post hoc or is considered additional or exploratory analysis. So I suppose in terms of industry versus academia, this is quite a common theme where some authors have been trying to find statistical significance in post hoc and in additional analysis, but they often retrofit this to fit the clinical questions and report it without giving context to the fact that it was of exploratory nature. And this is where the selective reporting of outcomes comes in, where if it wasn't in the protocol, it's considered exploratory, and it's kind of more fitting to them to publish positive findings. And I think this is the importance of pre-publishing a statistical analysis plan can help reduce selective reporting of outcomes in terms of knowing what's out there and in terms of being able to spot deviations. So this is probably my favorite slide. I suppose I'm a bit biased because I'm a biomedical scientist, but the lack of methodological and statistical rigor in preclinical studies. So this is quite a common theme in the literature as well, in terms of, for example, if you take a drug trial and a novel compound that's being tested in mice and rats in the lab, if that is not of sound statistical methodological rigor, how can we be confident in that compound going into first-in-man trials, going into clinical trials? It may have an impact on human studies. One author, this is quite funny, discussed the data being of higher level of control, precision, and reliability in preclinical studies, not just because it's in a lab setting, but because mice are actually easier to control than humans. Mice tend to adhere to instructions more so than telling a clinical trial participant to take their drug. So to my knowledge, there is no regulation or requirement for statistician involvement or even statistician consultation in preclinical studies. And what the literature shows is that studies with animals in preclinical studies often lack power, which has an impact on the correct sample size. Also the fact that it might waste resources. Sometimes they don't account for confounding factors. They select outcome measures deemed irrelevant to those of a human clinical condition. So again, statistical rigor is not just in trials, but in preclinical studies to ensure it's relevantly translated into humans. So again, just a quick whistle-stop tour then of everything I discussed. Early involvement of statisticians in data management from the beginning, understanding statistics as being critical in decision-making aspects of a trial. Funding, so it's quite a big theme in the literature as well in terms of how do we find funding to cover salaries and grants to implement statistical methods. One author mentioned poorly developed statistical analyses prevents researchers from obtaining additional funding. So one of the solutions, I suppose, was including statisticians as a co-investigator in grant proposals to not only cover salaries, but also to cover resources. Time and workloads, quite a big barrier to statistical rigor in terms of lack of time to communicate with one another, communicating with regulators. Availability of statisticians, and that kind of comes into the whole time and workloads thing, where one of the ex-chair of the statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry discussed how some of the major EU countries lack qualified statisticians in their own regulatory agencies. And they relied on external consultancies rather than hiring them full time. Conflicts of interest in the context of evidence-based medicines and trials, disclosing conflicts of interest reassures that evidence stemming from research can actually be trusted. So this is where industry and academia heavily plays a role, where often in academia our statisticians are part of the department and administratively part of the trial that's going on, whereas in industry there's a lot of calls for them to be as administratively independent as possible in terms of ensuring they have their own funding. They don't have monetary incentives to publish positive findings. Some of the literature, aside from financial conflicts of interest, discuss intellectual conflicts of interest as well, in terms of having an extra statistician, as I mentioned, doing the interim monitoring analysis and relaying information to a data monitoring committee so that their own interpretation of a statistical finding does not impact the future conduct of a trial. So if you know that a trial should go on or shouldn't go on, that has an impact on the conduct of a trial without discussing with the DMC. And that's kind of where the internal, external statisticians came in that I talked about earlier. You heard me mention quite a number of times adherence to documents, protocol, statistical analysis plan, pre-publishing your statistical analysis plan to prevent selective reporting, guidelines, good statistical practice, European codes of good practice, directives, legislation, guidelines from the regulatory authorities. I suppose sometimes they're overlooked, and I understand that guidelines, not one guideline will fit all kind of things, but it's important to, I suppose, take what's relevant to a trial. Monitoring, I'm going to leave this bit for Caroline, who had an absolutely brilliant webinar a few weeks ago. But just in terms of the statistical aspect, it's important to see the cost effectiveness of, for example, risk-based monitoring or centralized statistical monitoring and on-site monitoring. Resources, quite important as well. There's discussion in the literature about trial groups that lack resources to implement clinical data management software systems that produce data compliant with ICH guidelines that I mentioned. So one of the solutions from the literature was calling for an open source clinical data management software system, and ones that adhere to clinical data interchange standards consortium guidelines. So the credibility of complete, reliable, and correctly processed data is dependent on the quality and validity of statistical methods, but also on the software used. And this is where the barrier comes in as well in terms of funding and the cost of resources, where academic-led and publicly funded trials may not always have the resources or the funding to be able to implement these software systems. Teaching and learning, as I discussed as well, from statisticians being teachers and learners in a trial. Communication, again, a lack of communication between statisticians, scientists, clinicians, members of regulatory authorities may cause misunderstandings, not just in the intended study objectives, but also in terms of discussing statistical methods. So where kind of all this fits in with my own PhD project? Well, through understanding roles, responsibilities, and rights of not just statisticians, but principal investigators and data management team members, I plan to investigate barriers and facilitators to statistical rigor in creating clinical trials. And as I discussed, kind of using industry, I suppose, as a backdrop, to look more into publicly funded trials and trials in university institutions within the Republic of Ireland. I plan on conducting this through semi-structured interviews with clinical trial professionals based in our 5 clinical research centres, clinical research facilities in Ireland. And I hope to combine findings from the literature, international guidelines, and findings from my interviews to produce a set of recommendations to address the barriers and facilitators to academic-led trials in the Republic of Ireland. So just to kind of leave you with a final quote, I mentioned Fisher at the beginning, I'm mentioning Fisher now. To call in the statistician after the experiment is done may be no more than asking him to perform a post-mortem examination. He may be able to say what the experiment died of. But again, it just shows the importance of statistician involvement from the beginning. So those are my references. So I'd just like to thank my supervisors, Professor College, for their incredible support, Dr. Marie Galligan and Professor Declan Devan, HRB-TMRN. Thank you to my lovely health systems colleagues here with me today. Thank you to the HRB-TMRN for this lovely opportunity. Questions if you've got.
That's great. Thank you, Marina. That was a fantastic presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Sandra. Yeah.
That's great. So I just want to open the floor there to both our colleagues who have joined us online via the webinar, but also those, if anyone in the room there in the health systems team would like to pose a question, if they could do so through you, Marina, and we can share with the group here online. I think you, great. I suppose just to kind of kick things off, I think you touched on a great opener there when you said that trials originate from statistical thinking. It makes me think particularly of the design of clinical trials, and yet the story today among trialists is very different, and it seems to be this, a post-event analysis and people coming with questions after the fact. And as your final point there about how you can probably tell what went wrong, but you certainly can't analyse or help the trial be the best it could be. I think you've touched on some really good subjects there. I think what's also interesting, and you did touch on this, and we mentioned it at the start, that you're not a statistician, but I actually think that's a wonderful benefit, because you're approaching this from, I suppose, from the point of view of like the rest of us, that we're not, most of us are not statisticians, and that you bring a different perspective to the work that you're doing, and I think that's something that's really interesting. So if anyone would like to ask Marina a specific question, you can do so via the Q&A facility or the chat facility on the right-hand side of the screen. One item that you touched on as well, Marina, was the fear of novel statistical methods, which I think was kind of fascinating. And I suppose I would be in trouble if I didn't promote the HRB-TMRN SWOT initiative, in which we are offering funding for people to conduct studies within a trial, which is very suitable for exploring new methods of statistical analysis. And one of our 2016 recipients of this award was Ricardo Segurado, who is with CSTAR in UCD. And CSTAR are involved with the HRB-TMRN in providing statistical support, and so too are our colleagues throughout the CRC and CRS. One item, Marina, that you touched on as well is about the 3 levels of statistical involvement. You mentioned the study statistician, the independent statistician, and also at the DMC, the Data Management Committee. How do you think that plays currently? I mean, have you pitched that idea or that recommendation to many people, and have you gotten feedback on that yet, or is that something that you hope to do as part of your interviews?
Yeah, absolutely, Sandra. That's a really good question. I think through talk, reading the literature was great, but in terms of actually finding out from talking to statisticians here in the CRCs, I think the general consensus is that sometimes we may not even need all 3, especially for a low-risk trial. So if you've got a non-pharmacological trial, for example, you may not even need a data monitoring committee, let alone a data monitoring committee statistician. In terms of conflicts of interest, again, it might play a role in the reason we need at least 2, in terms of having a study statistician to have general oversight, but also one that is being blinded to the data, but then having an independent statistician that is external to the university. It might play a role in terms of not having someone linked from the treatment database to the trial, from treatment to the trial database. I think also kind of funding and feasibility of having the 2 statisticians, it might be great, and it will certainly reduce the workload, but it might not always be feasible. So definitely something I plan to investigate as well, the feasibility of it and the actual need for it.
And I think what would be interesting as well in those interviews is you mentioned the rights of statisticians. I think that's a really interesting, I think it's a very right way of saying it. I don't think people say it enough, probably. We certainly get, there's maybe a sense that statistical involvement is an afterthought, incorrectly so. Do you have a sense of the rights of statisticians, as you put it, or is that something that you will explore in your interviews and see what it is that statisticians want from a study? As you mentioned, it could be authorship or, I'm guessing, funding, and to actually employ these people to get involved in analysis. Is that something that you've got a sense of now, or will you explore that in more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good question. I think the co-authorship was quite big as well, and then I think there's quite mixed views about it in terms of people thinking, well, why wouldn't you include a statistician from day one? Why wouldn't you include them as a co-author? But then the literature kind of went as far as saying include them as a co-investigator, and I think that's quite a brilliant idea, especially in terms of guaranteeing funding that they'll be there from day one. I think, and absolutely, I think you're right in terms of the rights as well. I've seen statisticians being given the trial data, an entire data set as a trial has been completed. The trialists have asked them, can you please help analyze this? And I've seen statisticians say to them, you know, off on your merry way, and I can't help, I don't know the underlying assumptions. I wasn't there to plan the research question, I won't be able to help with the analysis. So I think it's acknowledging their work from the beginning, acknowledging the fact that this isn't just, you know, us talking about how you need statistical help, but it's the ICH guidelines referring to the fact that they need to be acknowledged. Yeah, it's something that I really would like to look at as well, not just the rights in terms of full collaborators and authorship, but also how they fit into the team, and in terms of collaboration and communication as well. Yeah.
Great. You also touched on the idea behind journals, promoting this and targeting it from a publication point of view, which we've learned from, for example, prospectively registering trials. If obviously if the carrot is the publication for some people, then why not enforce it at the very start? And you mentioned, I know you touched on that actually in one of your slides. I was going to ask you on that, but you said that some editors do ask for this. If you could kind of quantify that, is it widespread with journals? Is it evolving? Is there any journals that are doing this particularly well? Do you have some examples from that already, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good point as well, and I haven't looked too much into the journal side of things as well, but from what the authors have been discussing about journals, the ICMJE, now their framework for authorship has come out. I think this is a paper from 2001 that said the person responsible for the statistical content of a trial should be recognized as an author. And that may be a statistician, it may not be a statistician, but it's the person who was involved all the way through. That's the ICMJE, I think it's the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors. And then they've also stated something important, is that if no statistician is an author, they need to justify that. If they don't have a statistician to write the trial, that needs to be justified. And something else as well, I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine made their stance kind of an additional, exploratory statistical analysis quite clear. And if it's not in the protocol, it's considered exploratory. And if you're reporting exploratory or additional analysis as a primary analysis that wasn't stated, that to me that kind of sounds like, I don't know, scientific misconduct to a certain point. It's just that you're selectively reporting positive findings. And I know I sound like Ben Goldacre here from Bad Facts and Bad Science. This is where the industry academia kind of comes in terms of financial incentives for reporting. So I think that it's great that the journals are mandating the use of consort guidelines as well in terms of reporting. And I think that I have an example here, the Journal of American Cardiology expect authors of trial reports to adhere to consort guidelines. And a lot of other journals as well, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're calling for strengthening the statistical peer review of trials. So having trial reports being peer reviewed by statisticians as well.
Great. We just have a comment from one of our online attendees here that they were really delighted to hear about the concept of translational statistics. And I think that was John Hind and Johnny Newell in my Galway that you were quoting earlier. As a clinician, I am acutely aware that outcomes that are found not to be statistically significant are often extremely clinically significant to service users, and I think that needs to be acknowledged as important. And that's certainly something that you touched on in your presentation, and I suppose it's, for some people, maybe a new concept, those that are, as you say, with the p-value being the holy grail, I suppose, for researchers, but it may or may not be as important when you're talking about clinical significance.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a really good point as well. So I think it goes both ways as well, in the sense that a statistically significant finding, while it may not always be clinically relevant for that particular trial, it may have clinical value for another trial as well. And that's why I think the reporting is quite important of course, to acknowledge the work of the trialists that put in the money and the funding and the resources to a trial, but also to prevent duplication of other trials. If you have a statistically insignificant result, report it. If you have a statistically significant result, report it. Because in some way, it makes clinical sense. And if it's not clinically significant, if it doesn't have an impact on treatment or clinical settings, patient management, it'll still benefit someone somewhere. I think that's where the transparency of reporting kind of comes in. And David Mower gave a really, really good talk about that in the symposium as well.
Great, excellent. And actually, there's another talk that has come to mind is that when you mentioned data monitoring committees, we have a webinar, and the recording of that is available on our website, but from Peter Sanderco from Edinburgh, who gave a really great overview on data monitoring committees and the importance of them. And even at the introduction, it was a good overview of, I suppose, what can go wrong when you don't have appropriate data monitoring committee in place and the importance of it. So that's really great. Just before we wrap up, is anyone there, Marina? I'm conscious that there's a room full of people looking at you there. Do they have any questions which they can relate to you, and then you could relate to the online audience? No pressure.
Does anyone have any questions? No, I think everyone in the room is good. So.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much for giving today's webinar. Thanks to everybody who joined us online, and thanks also to the Health Systems team there in UCD for coming in and supporting Marina in person. That was a fantastic overview. As I said, we will be, this has been recorded, and we will be adding it to the HRB-TMRN website this afternoon for those who want to have a look back on today's webinar and discussion. I just want to highlight that the next event, actually one of them is actually the main HRB conference, which is on the 30th of November in Dublin Castle, and I hope to see a lot of our colleagues at that event. It's celebrating 30 years of the Health Research Board, and also coming up in December, again mentioning our C-STAR colleagues there in UCD, they have 3 SPSS courses over 3 days. You can attend 1, 2 or 3 of these events, and details are on our website and as well as at the C-STAR website. So again, Marina, thank you so much for delivering today's webinar. It's really appreciated, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for everyone for listening.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye.